Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest installment of the Academia SG Junior Scholar Seminar. So I'm very happy today. I should introduce myself, Ian Chong. I'm one of the Academia SG editors. We're very happy today to welcome Sylvia Ang from Deakin University, where she's the Alfred Deakin Postdoctoral Research Fellow. And she works on migration and the ethnic Chinese communities overseas. She recently has had a book out, actually. So this would be Contesting Chineseness, Nationality, Class, Gender, and New Chinese Migrants, out from the University of Amsterdam Press. She'll be talking with us today a little bit about her research. And also for our discussant, we have Gong Jianwen, who is Assistant Professor of History at the National University of Singapore. He too has recently had a book out. It's Diasporic Cold War Warriors. He too works a lot on migration, and especially of the ethnic Chinese. All right, so let me not waste any more of your time and turn things over to Sylvia. Please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ian, for the introduction, and thanks, Jianwen, for being my discussant today. So my name is Sylvia Ang, as Ian has introduced, and thank you for being here. And I'm really excited to share some of my findings from the book with you. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Just a moment. Okay, just checking that you are seeing my slides and not my notes.
Yes,
great.
Perfect.
That's great. All right. So to begin with, I'm based in Nam, which is the Aboriginal name for Melbourne, Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which I live and work, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This talk, as Ian mentioned, draws from my recently published book. I will be presenting one of the chapters of the book titled Not the Lower Classes. But before I do that, I would like to give you some context to the book and also to the chapter. Just a note to clarify that the talk will be referring to Chinese migrants as new arrivals from mainland China since the 1990s. Now, one way to understand the effects of China's rise is to examine how ethnic Chinese overseas perceive China and its outflow of new Chinese migrants. With the rise of China, Singapore, like other high-income countries dependent on international capital flows, must now grapple with the shift from Western-based capital flows to Chinese-based capital flows. At the same time, due to China's uneven developing status, host societies must negotiate the flows of new Chinese migrants, which consists, on the one hand, higher wage professionals, but also low wage workers. The number of Chinese migrants in Singapore at its peak in 2011 was estimated at between 700,000 to 1 million. You may know already that Singapore's total population as of June last year is at 5.45 million. While the number of Chinese nationals in Singapore has since fallen, it is still the second largest migrant population, second only to Malaysians, occupying 18% of Singapore's foreign-born population. The large inflows of Chinese migrants since the 1990s is due to the Singaporean state's liberal immigration regulations to meet skills shortages and improve low birth rates. China is a key source country for both higher wage and high net worth immigrants who are encouraged to settle permanently in Singapore, as well as low wage temporary labor migrants. Due to falling Singaporean-Chinese birth rates, the state's liberal policies towards Chinese migrants settling is also a move to maintain the status quo of a dominant 75 to 76% ethnic Chinese population in Singapore. Now, I think some of you might know this already. The reception of new Chinese migrants, however, has been less than warm in Singapore. I won't go into the details here. It is discussed in the book. For me, the tensions between Singaporean-Chinese and new Chinese arrivals presented a puzzle. Why are there tensions between ethnic Chinese settlers and new Chinese arrivals, despite similarities in phenotype, ancestry, and customs? Now, there are many ways to address this puzzle, depending on whether you are a political scientist, historian. I am a sociologist mainly, but much of my work is interdisciplinary. So I chose to look at this puzzle through the social imaginaries of Chineseness. The book approaches Chineseness as processual or fluid rather than fixed. And I consider the question, what is Chineseness, to be less important than the question, how is Chineseness constructed? Through this approach, the book does three things. First, I draw out how Singaporean-Chinese and Chinese migrants have different imaginaries of Chinese identity. Second, I show how participants' imaginaries of Chineseness intersect with nationality, class, and gender. Third, I highlight how participants' imaginaries shape and are shaped by state discourses of Chineseness and China's ascent. The methods I use are interviews, ethnography, and digital ethnography. I started fieldwork in 2013. I went back in 2014. I had biannual follow-ups from 2015 to 2018. And I actually wrote this book while I was in Singapore when I was at NUS postdoc in 2019 and 2020. Altogether, I talked to and spent time with 62 participants, comprising both Singaporean-Chinese, 24 of them, and mainland Chinese migrants, 38 of them. In terms of contributions, theoretically, studies on migration and ethnic relations are predominantly focused on the white other binary, reinforcing the idea that only white people discriminate against people of color, right? Whether Black people or whether Chinese people. The settings of these studies are also predominantly set in the West. So my focus with the book on tensions among the same ethnic group, the Chinese, hopes to contribute by looking at issues beyond skin color. In other words, that stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination can happen among people of the same phenotype and beyond Western settings. Practically, the book hopes to do three things. First, to give voice to Chinese migrants. Second, highlight that stereotypes and prejudice have very real consequences for migrants, their sense of belonging and well-being. Third, link the tensions happening on the ground to greater social structures, including Singapore immigration policies and the rise of China. Okay, before I move on, which I'm going to very quickly, I want to point out that many of the narratives that you will see in the next few slides involve stereotypes and prejudice. I do not endorse them. I detail them for the purpose of unpacking them from an academic perspective. I would appreciate it if they are not circulated for the purposes of reproducing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Okay, so let's begin. The Chinese people Singaporeans don't like, we don't like too. Cici had just arrived at the interview with her boyfriend Teddy and said this to me before she had even sat down. Hailing from Shanghai and Anhui respectively, Cici and Teddy were both in their early 30s and made a handsome, well-dressed couple. It had been difficult to secure an interview with them. As professionals in the IT industry, they traveled frequently overseas for work and pleasure. They had in fact just spent a couple of weeks in Germany and then Australia. Now, Cici's comment caught me off guard. I had previously informed them that the interview would be about their experiences as migrants and their interaction with locals. I did not mention any stereotypes. Cici seemed aware of the stereotypes of Chinese migrants in Singapore and was quick to state her stance. She's not like them. Importantly, it was also an act to identify with Singaporeans by stating that they did not like the Chinese people, whom she later described as people who, I quote, speak, talk loudly on their mobile phones and litter, unquote. She wanted it known that she was more like Singaporeans, who according to her are more civilized. As Chinese professionals, Cici and some of the study's other participants are well-traveled cosmopolitans who de-emphasize their Chinese identity. as they told me they do not choose the countries they live in based on whether there is a large Chinese population. I observed some participants' American accented English as they shared their globe-trotting experiences and their easiness when speaking of years living abroad in several countries. I saw that they imagined themselves as part of an affluent, globally oriented middle class. However, as I found out from some of my other participants, professional Chinese migrants' claims to a global middle class are denied by many Singaporean Chinese. Min Hui, for instance, is a 32-year-old scientist who has lived in Singapore for more than a decade and received Singaporean citizenship a couple of years ago. She told me that despite her professional background, she, I quote, finds it hard to avoid discrimination, unquote. And she told me she frequently experienced Singaporean Chinese shooting her dirty looks in public. One time, Ming Hui told me she was browsing in a mall when an old Singaporean Chinese lady said to her in an offensive tone out of the blue, "You must be from China." Although she held her tongue, Ming Hui told me she felt so angry that she wanted to retort, "You are from China too. You merely arrived a few decades before me." Ming Hui informed me that other than her fairer skin tone, she felt what marked her as a Chinese was, I quote, "the way you carry yourself may be a little different," unquote. She posited that she was unlike Singaporeans who have a penchant for dyed hair and trendy fashion styles. Min Hui's reflection matched my research observations. Singaporean Chinese frequently marked Chinese migrants as different, as sensorially disturbing and even repulsive, whether in terms of dressing, hygiene, or morality. Despite Min Hui's official Singaporean citizenship, she is made to feel like she does not belong. Min Hui reminded me that even as Chinese migrants' professional status may expedite their claims to formal Singaporean citizenship, Singaporean Chinese imaginaries can manifest to deny them cultural citizenship, which is the right to belong, even as you are different. Now, Jean Beeman in her 2016 paper discussed how citizenship can be a status as a legal demarcation. So, whether you're a citizen or non-citizen, right? But it also differentiates among citizens or creates different classes of citizens and therefore different degrees of full inclusion in society. So a focus on cultural citizenship, as I'll be focusing on in this presentation, reviews these dynamics. And I just want to note very quickly that Chinese migrants like Min Hui and Cici are different from the very rich people from China who emigrate to Singapore. Some studies have already shown that very rich businessmen and investors maintain strong affinities with China despite having migrated. And Gracia Liu has called them immigrating without settling. These very rich investors, very rich migrants may actually visit their country of immigration once or twice a year for holiday while they continue their businesses in China. So my research does not include any interviewees from the very rich category. The middle class Chinese participants I interviewed are heavily invested in their lives in Singapore. They have already bought or are looking to buy HDB flats, and many hope to settle permanently and build families in Singapore. Now, this picture I took here is really interesting because I took it at Singapore, at Singapore's Chinatown, and it's at a shop selling northern Chinese food. And you can see that these perhaps more expensively dressed female Chinese migrants actually placed a designer paper bag on the table to demarcate their space from the less expensively dressed migrant men. So in essence, this is really physically the manifestation of what Cici was trying to do to distinguish herself from apparently less civilized Chinese migrants. Okay, now, Janet is a Singaporean Chinese woman in her early 20s who works in the financial industry. She's fair-skinned, has soft facial features, and long, straight black hair. Janet told me she has often been mistaken for a Chinese migrant in Singapore, which makes her feel insulted, despite attempts to appease her by attributing the mistake to her fairness and beauty. She spoke to me about the difference between Singaporean Chinese and Chinese migrants, making several references to dressing, as you can see from the slide over there. So I won't read them all. You can read most of them yourself. I asked Janet if she has taken any measures to avoid being mistaken for a Chinese migrant. She said she has by, I quote, dressing properly, unquote, and wearing shoes. Now, I must have appeared quite baffled at the mention of shoes, as she quickly laughed and informed me that China girls don't wear shoes. I was curious, what do they wear? Slippers or sandals, Janet tells me, in a very weird dress style, according to her. Now, the way Chinese migrants dress was an issue that turned up repeatedly in my research. Mary, for instance, is a Singaporean-Chinese. She works as a sales associate at a large department store. She deals intimately with clothes on an everyday basis and told me that she was very familiar with the many Chinese migrants who worked alongside her or who were customers. While talking with Mary, I had mentioned that I personally found it hard to tell a Chinese migrant from a Singaporean-Chinese, to which she confidently replied, we can mostly tell. You can see from the slide over there. She says Chinese like to wear socks. Now, Mary's narrative reminded me that my confession of the inability to tell Chinese migrants apart from Singaporean-Chinese was almost always met with Singaporean-Chinese telling me that they can. Benjamin, for instance, is a Singaporean-Chinese who works as a sales manager. He told me that he can tell if one is a Chinese migrant through looking at the way they walk and their dressing. And he informed me that telltale signs of a China Chinese, in his words, were in the malfunction way they dress. He assured me that while Singaporeans may not be the best dressers, Chinese migrants were worse off as they mismatched their clothes. He explained that Chinese migrants are all out, dressed their best, because they came from the village, insinuating that Chinese migrants overdress since they are unfamiliar with city dwellers' dress styles. Other than the lack of taste in dressing, hygiene was a recurring theme in my research. Now, alongside Mary, I actually spoke with Jiahua and Carrie. The three of them are friends, so I met them all together. Jiahua works at a food court and informed me that there are Singaporeans who would be unhappy to be served by Chinese migrants at a food stall. I asked why, and Carrie interrupted to say they are very dirty, to which Jiahua quipped, it's true. You can see what Jiahua said over there in the slide. Dirty for my participants, however, was not only linked to how Chinese migrants prepared food, but also to smell. Kenneth is an engineer in his 30s who was upfront with acknowledging that he is anti-immigration. He spends considerable time on the train every day, and he tells me he does not like squeezing on the train with what he perceived as numerous immigrants, especially the, I quote, smell if you happen to be in the train with some mainland Chinese people, unquote. Singaporean Chinese imaginaries are also influenced by the circulation of news with inverted commas, online about Chinese nationals that reinforce imaginaries about their hygiene. Kenneth is a case in point, as he told me he is tuned into local online forums that are known for admonishing immigrants in Singapore. So some of these popular alternative news websites such as All Singapore Staff, The Independent, they circulate headlines that associate Chinese nationals with dirt and poor hygiene. And these stories have actually manifested into real discrimination in Singapore's rental market, where rental advertisements blatantly state no PRCs, as you can see from the headline there covered by BBC. Okay, just a moment. Okay, Singaporean Chinese participants use dirty not only to refer to Chinese. Did I just move slides? I did. Just give me a moment. Okay, I just want to state that PRC is used colloquially in Singapore to denote Chinese nationals, often derogatorily, in case you didn't know what PRC stood for. All right. Now, Singaporean Chinese participants use dirty not only to refer to Chinese migrants in general, but specifically with regards to Chinese migrant women. Dirty can refer to one who is literally dirty, but also promiscuous, such as sex workers or women. Now, the English term dirty woman is not commonly used in Singapore, but its Mandarin counterpart is, at least with my participants. In Mandarin, dirty translates to 肮脏, and has been used by my Singaporean-Chinese participants to refer to Chinese migrant women. As one Singaporean-Chinese male participant commented, dirty Chinese migrant women may still connote meanings of literal dirt, but 肮脏 Chinese migrant women immediately conjured for him the image of an illicit sex worker. It was no wonder then that the predominantly Mandarin conversation with Mary and Jiahua turned from literal dirt to immorality, and from Chinese migrants in general to Chinese migrant women. Now, on the topic of Chinese migrant women, Mary claimed to know much about their apparent misdeeds and told me a few stories, including a personal one. She feistily related how a Chinese migrant woman had once called her house, looking for her brother who is disabled. Mary was suspicious and asked what she wanted, and the woman responded that she wanted to be friends with Mary's brother. So Mary rehashed the scene for me. She pretended to use her hand as a phone and screamed into it. You want to be friends with him? He's dying. Do you want to die with him? Pop, before slamming the phone down. Mary's stories were not unusual. They fitted with many other stories of Chinese migrant women in Singapore who apparently snatch husbands, seduce ill or old men for their money. These stories are not only circulated among my participants, but also online. If you do a simple Google search for PRC woman Singapore, you will get top results such as, beware, PRC woman married me to get PR and scam my money. Like Mary, Jiahua also had her share of stories, including a detailed one of a Chinese migrant woman she observed at a lottery shop in Singapore. So that's in the slide, you can read it for yourself. Essentially, really, she's talking about how, Chinese migrant women will target older men, and those apparently they will sell socks at coffee shops, but actually they're selling sex. And I think what I really want to note, and I'm going to come back to this in my analysis in the next slide, is how she talks about there are so many of them. So the later part, she actually says so many, they are like everywhere, right? Hawker centers everywhere. Okay, now to my analysis. So sociologist Calvin Low at NUS suggested that complaints about sensory disturbances are social cultural expressions of rejection. In other words, sensory disturbances can serve to demarcate us versus them. Mary, Benjamin, and Janet implied that Chinese migrants' dressing was an affront to their sense of sight, whether in terms of ugly socks or in Benjamin's words, malfunction. Janet took deliberate measures to dress properly so as not to be mistaken for a Chinese migrant. Jiahua, Carrie, and Kenneth expressed that their senses were disturbed by Chinese migrants, whether in terms of dirty food preparation or smell. Their articulations are part of a greater imaginary, where Chinese migrants are generalized to be dirty and to have poor hygiene. The link between sensory disturbances and immorality was also not lost, with Singaporean-Chinese participants whose talk about literal dirt evolved to refer to dirty Chinese migrant women. Singaporean-Chinese participants' complaints of sensory disturbances are linked to their repulsion to Chinese migrants. As feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed observed, repulsion can be a visceral state where sensation and sentiment can overwhelm a body at the same time. Now let's go back to Jiahua from the last slide. I noted as her voice rose when she talked about Chinese migrant women, especially at the words many and everywhere. Suddenly, I saw Mary swell with anger and her face reddened as she told her stories of Chinese migrant women. Sensory disturbances and repulsion are social cultural expressions of rejection that are tightly linked to class. Now, George Orwell understood physical repulsion to be so strong that he adds that it may not matter so much if a middle-class person is nurtured to believe that the working classes are dishonest or boorish. And he says, you can see from the quote over there, it is when he is brought up to believe that they are dirty that the harm is done. Singaporean-Chinese participants' expressions of rejection also match sociologists' Pierre Bourdieu's observation that people can be constructed as different, not primarily on a lack of material resources, but a lack of taste. Bourdieu pointed out that taste acts as a status marker, It can be used by the upper classes to exclude the lower classes. Singaporean-Chinese imaginary of Chinese migrants as distasteful positions them into the lower classes, a class position that fits into a greater imaginary about Chinese migrants in Singapore. This greater imaginary imagines Chinese migrants as of the lower classes because they came from the village, right? Recalling Benjamin's words, and embodying the developing status of China. As nationals of a developing country, so the imaginary goes, they have bad taste in dressing, poor hygiene, and would do anything for money, i.e. immorality. Chinese migrants and Chinese migrant women in particular are, according to Singaporean-Chinese participants, ubiquitous. Whether it's calling one's brother out of the blue, dealing with food sold to Singaporeans at the lottery shop, hawker centers, or coffee shops, they are, as Xiahua said, everywhere. Sociologist Stephanie Lawler, in the study of class, suggested that the middle class sees the working class as a swarming mess, which threatens the middle class individualism and distinction. As such, the middle class finds it necessary to identify the mess. In this case, the mess are the Chinese migrants. They are threatening because they could easily blend in with Singaporean Chinese. By portraying Chinese migrants as sensory disturbances, they are made recognizable and acts to counter anxieties that Singaporean Chinese participants have. As you can see from the slide over there, Janet expressed that Singaporean Chinese are mistaken for China people. And she says, where is the Singaporean if every Chinese here is assumed to be from China? Her anxiety is not only in being mistaken for the apparently badly dressed, immoral Chinese migrant woman, but also of Singaporeans being engulfed by the Chinese migrant masses. At the heart of Singaporean Chinese anxieties lie immigration and citizenship. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of this last part of the chapter, where I use the case study of this viral video to show the manifestations of Singaporean Chinese anxieties with immigration and citizenship. In the book, I analyzed the comments on websites which circulated this viral video of Chinese migrant women apparently misbehaving. I've listed some of these comments here. In essence, most of the comments revolved around the Chinese migrant women's source of income and how they managed to obtain Singaporean PR, including calls for the state to remove their PRs. The comments presented a similar imaginary. The Chinese migrant women should not have qualified for PR since they were apparently mistresses and or sex workers. Now, these comments function to not only label them as lower class, but also to justify claims that their lower class status should not have allowed them to gain Singaporean permanent residence. I think really the comments listed here are useful to draw out the link between imagining Chinese migrants as lower classes and the justification that they should not be Singaporean PRs or citizens. Okay, to conclude, I have shown how Singaporean Chinese use sensory disturbances and repulsion to differentiate Chinese migrants as the lower classes, whether in terms of dressing, hygiene, and or morality. Chinese migrants' imagined lower class status is linked to Singaporean Chinese denial of their cultural citizenship and therein their full inclusion in Singaporean society. I'd like to return to Min Hui, whom we met in the introduction to this chapter. We see that despite having lived in Singapore for more than a decade, and even acquiring Singaporean citizenship, she does not feel like she belongs, not only in an intellectual sense, but also visually. After all, as she said, despite her professional background, her fair skin tone, her undyed hair, and non-trendy fashion style will almost always mark her as a Chinese migrant in the eyes of the Singaporean Chinese. Middle-class Chinese migrants like Min Hui may possess Singaporean PR or citizenship, and even aspire to depart from a social imaginary of Chineseness to one that is beyond ethnicity, nationality, and gender. Yet, Singaporean Chinese imaginaries of Chineseness do not differentiate Chinese migrants from where they were born. In this imaginary, Chinese migrants do not belong, whether as of the global middle class, as Singaporean PR, or citizens. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. It's a fascinating presentation. Let me turn things over now to Jianwen.
Sure. So thank you, Ian, and thank you, Sylvia. That was a fascinating talk about the perennially salient question of tensions between so-called new Chinese migrants from China and the so-called local Chinese population. So in the talk, right, we heard Sylvia talk about how hygiene and dress serve as markers of class, taste, morality, and cultural citizenship. Right? And she uses this to explain how Singaporean-Chinese seek to exclude supposedly lower class new migrants from an imagined middle-class national community. I really like as well how gender figures into analysis, right? What we might describe as a kind of unofficial grassroots nationalism, right, with strong xenophobic overtones. So the tensions that she describes, right, have unfolded in the last few decades at the intersection of increased immigration from China to Singapore and beyond, right? Obviously, China's expanding economic, political, and cultural influence in the world, and the rising cost of living in an increasingly middle class, but also neoliberal Singapore. So I'm a historian, and as a historian, I can't help but reflect on how the tensions that she describes, right, between so-called new and settled Chinese populations have manifested themselves at multiple historical junctures, right? For example, between what were then also new migrants and more creolized Straits Chinese in the 19th century, right, in Singapore and in Malaya, and in Southeast Asia more generally. Right? I'm reminded too of the forced migration of ordinary KMT soldiers and the families from China to Taiwan in the last years of the Chinese Civil War, and the long history of friction even in Taiwan today, for example, between so-called mainlanders and native Taiwanese. Right? Instances of sort of inter-ethnic tensions within sort of broader quote-unquote Chinese populations. Episodes which come out of different contexts, but which I think viewed alongside each other underscore the need for us to think critically about Chineseness, right, as a heterogeneous and contested category for diverse Chinese peoples and states. And so we can acknowledge, I think, what Sylvia calls similarities in phenotype, ancestry, and customs, while also being mindful of linguistic and cultural differences, especially as they have evolved and been constructed historically, right? So as not to risk reproducing the official ahistorical racial categories of both, right? Both the CCP and the PAP governments. But as her talk points out, I think there's no avoiding official discourses, right? Historical or otherwise. Notions of Chinese quote unquote cultural deficiency as manifested in so-called backwards bodily practices such as spitting, right, circulated widely in the colonial world, and were in fact promoted by modernizing reformers in China and elsewhere. Right? And it's interesting that today the PRC constantly exhorts its citizens and tourists, right, to behave in a civilized manner befitting of a global superpower, even as its critics, right, seek to ascribe blame, for example, on COVID-19 on China's unhygienic open-air wet markets. And I think contemporary relations between Singaporean-Chinese and PRC migrants draw from and reproduce such discourses. So I want to conclude with a question that attempts to connect some of the themes in Sylvia's talk to another noteworthy and indeed contemporaneous trend, right, among the sort of the broadly defined Chinese community in Singapore. And that is the increasingly positive perceptions of the PRC. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. So can we and how do we link negative perceptions of PRC migrants, right, to favorable attitudes toward the PRC government, right? These trends seem to me to be incompatible at first glance because they seem to come out of two different conceptions of Chineseness, right? One is localized and Singaporean, and the other as transnational and Sinocentric. So I would love to hear from you on how you think these trends are linked to each other, if at all. And those are my comments, and I suppose we can now open things up to questions from the audience.
All right, thank you very much, Jingwen. So what I'll do is I'll collect a few questions, and Sylvia, you can answer as you see fit. So starting off, we do have a question from Xin Yuguan, who asks, how language and accent function as markers of citizenship and become sites of contestation. I think this is important to raise because Singaporeans, despite the Speak Mandarin campaign, have not historically, ethnic Chinese in Singapore have not historically spoken Mandarin, right? And so accents and things like that, they do, I think, appear quite starkly different sometimes. And then when it comes to the othering of arrivals from China, right? Whether this, there's a question also from Xin, whether this has evolved over time, right? It seems that the scapegoating of migrants from the PRC has now shifted to migrants from from the Indian subcontinent, right? And we've got also from Nessa Swin, whether the tensions that you focus on can be more accurately conceptualized as xenophobia, so Singaporeanness versus rather than racism, and how meaningful such distinctions are to you, given that the analytical concepts, right, that we talk about here in social tensions, they seem to inform the present day context of your inquiry. Now, I've actually got something to tack on to this because I think it's sort of related. I think it'd be interesting if you could unpack for us what you actually mean by Chineseness and what you think your respondents mean by Chineseness, because Chineseness in some respects is historically rooted, as Jianwen will know. I mean, it's a very late 19th century, early 20th century phenomenon to have this idea of a sort of pan-Chineseness where things seem to be a lot more regional previously. So how do these play in, and how do ideas of nationality play in? Because a lot of the class background of people that you talked about, they seem very similar to Malaysian Chinese immigrants. They seem very similar to Hong Kong Chinese immigrants and Taiwanese immigrants. But the focus seems very much on PRC immigrants, right? Despite that they may be professionals and middle class and all that as well. So how do these sorts of things play in? How do they play into the how do they reflect historically? There's historically been the Singkek or Totok Peranakan tension. And also, right, when you look at migration within the PRC, migrants to cities tend to be derided as well in very similar ways. So why don't you try to pick and choose what you can from those sorts of questions first, and then I'll go on to a second round. Please take it away. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Yang-Wen, for your comments, your question, and also thanks to, I think, Nessa and also Xinhui for your questions, and for Ian for your questions as well. It's quite a bit, so let me just kind of try to organize. I'll just start with, I think, Jianwen's question about how can we link negative perceptions of China to positive perceptions of China. I find this very amazing myself, coming from, so I have also researched Singaporean migrants who live in China, and some of them are still on my WeChat account, and they circulate these really nice things and good things about China and the Chinese government frequently, especially when it comes to some so-called tensions with the US. And at the same time, they are also the ones that would very quickly differentiate themselves from Chinese migrants. And I don't see that they see the contradictions in this behavior. And I find that very interesting. And I think it's very much to do, I have no answers for this, but I think it's very much to do, as you said, with the different, the situational, the situatedness of Chineseness that they choose to take on or circulate at that moment. So I think in the case of Singapore, what I've tried to argue, I think, is really the anxieties about immigration and citizenship on the ground. But on the other hand, when it comes to feeling like internationally that that whether America is being too much, or and then there's this rise of China that could bring Asian people up and Singaporean-Chinese up at the same time, then there is some pride in that as well. So myself, I'm also very interested to investigate how these two, I don't know what you call it, a binary or false binary, and how they interact. So that's something I would love to investigate. With regards to Singri questions on Mandarin, in fact, there is a chapter in the book that says, I am more Chinese than you. And it looks at how language functions to differentiate, how Singaporean-Chinese use language, and also how Chinese migrants use language to say that, hang on, I'm more Chinese than you because I can speak Mandarin properly. On the other hand, Singaporean-Chinese rhetorics, in that chapter, I look at their rhetorics, is that there are many different types of Chinese, and I don't have to speak Mandarin to be Chinese. So there is that kind of negotiations in there. So definitely, right? Definitely, language and accent can be markers of citizenship. And your second question on the othering of new arrivals. Now, this is very studies of race and ethnicity. The scholars of race and ethnicity have long established that discriminatory terms, racist terms as well, are circulated. And like Xiaowen say, some of these terms, in fact, some of these stereotypes that we see today are actually, have been around since colonial times. So it's actually, who's the next scapegoat is actually often the question, especially in context of intense immigration. So you're probably right that whether it has shifted to other kinds of rivals and a repetition of those terms. With Nessa's question, in the book itself, I don't actually claim that there is racism, except for one chapter, and that chapter is on racialization, actually more on racialization and racism. And in that chapter, I actually discuss how the racialization, now I want to make clear the difference between racialization and racism. So racialization is ascribing behavior to biological features, okay? But racism is more structural. So to locate racism, your analysis has to be a lot tighter to highlight institutionally the kind of structures that are available, which is why I say my kind of analysis is more racialization than racism, because I talk about in that chapter how behavior is ascribed to biological features, right? So ideas that Chinese migrants look a certain way and then they behave in a certain way. That's racialization. So for xenophobia is basically a fear of foreigners, right? But I think what I argue with my work is really there is a hierarchy of xenophobia, right? Who gets targeted most? And in my work, of course, I'm arguing that the Chinese migrants get targeted the most, followed by, it could be anybody else, maybe new arrived from India or, people from other kinds of backgrounds. But I don't feel like xenophobia sufficiently explains what I'm interested in, right? Which is the kind of tensions between inter-ethnic tensions, and which is why I have gone into kind of other terms like racialization in one of the chapters, but the rest of them is, I don't actually say specifically that whether it's racialization or what. More so, what I'm interested in, and this relates to Ian's question, is the construction of difference, the production of difference. How is difference produced? So for me, the labeling of whether it's xenophobia, stereotypes, prejudice is not as important as how these processes are constructed. And I think being able to see how they're constructed points to a lot of very important things, such as the interaction of tensions on the ground with greater structures like immigration policies and China's rise. So that is the focus of my work. Okay, and then I will get to Ian's very big question. I think there's several parts to the question. I may not be getting them all, but I think Ian was talking about the role of nationality. Yes, I think that in terms of the role of nationality, I'm really interested in the hierarchy of nationalities, which occurs everywhere. But of course, in Singapore as well, there is that. And I think definitely none of them, when I talk about Chinese migrants, whether it's in English or in Chinese, no Singaporean Chinese mentioned the Hong Kongers or the Taiwanese, none. They straight off went for the Chinese from mainland China. So there is that hierarchy of nationality that the Chinese migrants in that hierarchy are lower or lowest in their imaginaries, that they are not as worthy. There is certainly that. And in fact, I found it very interesting, when Ian talked about, rural urban migration in China, the rural migrants also suffer discrimination in the urban cities. And in fact, there's one chapter that I dedicate to, looking at low-wage migrant men, low-wage Chinese migrant men. And in that chapter, not in that chapter, but with those participants, the low-wage participants, they actually tell me that the kind of discrimination that they experience in Singapore is not very different from the kind of discrimination they experience in China, in the urban cities. And I found that very sad, actually, because they said, oh, it's not much difference. Like, they almost dismiss it like the discrimination here is nothing. It's the same in China. So, it's not something I should think too much about, because anyway, to earn significant wages, substantial wages, I need to leave my hometown. For low-wage workers, these are often, not the first or second tier cities anyway. So they don't really see that discrimination in Singapore is too alarming in that sense. And I think that those are my responses for now, if I haven't missed out anything. Yeah.
Okay, let me get to a second round of questions. I'll try to summarize some of them because I realize that we have questions come in fast and furious and we don't have that much time. Okay, there's a slightly different take from Daphne Lee, who asked, okay, so what about, you look at what happens with new arrival Chinese in other localities. So this migration of people from PRC, as you noted in the beginning, right, go to different places. So is the sort of reception different? James Flowers, coming from Korea, is asking, so when you look at how do you assess, right, the seeming paradox in which locals seem to resent new Chinese, but then we also see Singapore ranking at the top of, I mean, this gets to an earlier question, I think, to sort of figure out the difference between people and the state. That relationship seems to be something that's quite entangled in what you talk about. And he asked, how do these phenomena work together? You touched on some of this. Is that some Singaporeans take on the PRC mainstream discourse of, I'm not quite sure I get his hanging opinion, but James perhaps can clarify later.
The soldier D. So I think, I think Sylvia already addressed this question, because you talked about the Chinese immigrants in Singapore who said, oh, it's the same in China. So what I was getting at in my question was that many so-called Waidian, when they go to Beijing, Shanghai, they're called Suzhidi, and they are very often looked down upon and cursed at. So I'm just saying, I think you already addressed that. So I think it's very, very, just now you said you feel very sad, and also I agree with you, it's a similar phenomenon. So maybe it's transference of this problem from China into Singapore.
Okay, thanks, James. So anyways, before we go on, before I let Sylvia take things on, there's also a question from YY Mansell, who asks, is there a checklist for cultural citizenship, or is this somewhat of a lost cause? So take what you can from those, and then we'll try to move on. And I'm going to try to get everyone if I can. Oh, it's really coming in fast and furious. Go ahead.
Okay, that was like it's like speed dating but speed questioning answers.
Okay.
Okay, so reception in other countries, reception of Chinese people in other countries, yes. So I am also looking at Asian migrants and Chinese migrants in Australia myself. Of course, here then there is the white other binary. And then in Australia as well, there is a history of the white Australia policy. So here it's very blatantly said as racism. And I think that's also something that it's what's dominant in the literature, right? That only white people discriminate, or white people are racist. So to people of color, so that is the dominant kind of framework that is just kind of repeated in other countries. Of course, with COVID as well, you can see that that's happening in the US and things like that. I think what we lack is the vocabulary and work to highlight how these things happen in non-white settings is really, I think, a growing field and of interest. And I think there was one that was state versus people perception. So that's kind of already answered. There is an entanglement, like Ian said. And then there was the cultural citizenship question. Is it a lost cause? I mean, why am I working on this? Why did I work so hard and wrote this book for 2 years, guys? Is because I'm hoping it's not a lost cause, right? I'm hoping that we can rethink the kind of stereotypes and prejudice that is being circulated, and whether we can make migrants feel a greater sense of belonging and have a greater sense of well-being, which is why I'm working on this. Yes, that's all I got so far. Yeah.
All right, so moving on then. So we have a question from CK. So asking, how much does ahistoricism play into these characterizations of Chinese? Since ethnic Chinese people in Singapore used to be characterized as dirty and spitting and all that, right up into the 70s. That's why we have various campaigns about cleanliness, right? Junianti Putabarat asks, okay, so for new migrants from the PRC, do they receive sort of insults or discrimination from the old migrant ones? Then in such instances, how do ethnic Chinese people in Singapore perceive themselves toward China? Is it a sort of cultural orientation? Is it a political orientation? I think this keeps coming up because I think the cultural and the political side is somewhat mixed up altogether. I think disentangling that would be helpful. And Yao Tai Li asks if there are ways that the new Chinese arrivals can respond to these stereotypes or discrimination against them in Singapore. Let's stop there for now, because that's a whole bunch as well.
Okay, so with regards to ahistoricism, unfortunately, I haven't gone too back far in the history. I mean, I'm not a historian as well, but I think as discussed earlier by Tian Wen as well, and what I'm interested in really is colonialism. And some of the things that really people say are really kind of repetitive of colonial discourses. And so that's all I can say for that question. With regards to cultural versus political orientations, I think what's interesting is to highlight is that more recently, right, Lee Hsien Loong has highlighted in his National Day kind of rally speech that Singaporean-Chinese are different from other Chinese communities. So I think increasingly, even with this, I think initially with the large inflows of Chinese migrants into Singapore, there is this idea that perhaps they'll be easy migrants because they will integrate easily because they're Chinese. But more and more with the rise of China and also the rise of Chinese diasporic policies, right, towards overseas Chinese and wanting them to come back and help China kind of thing. This kind of discourses being circulated has made Singaporean Chinese and even the politicians in Singapore more aware that, hang on, we need to kind of make that differentiation because politically we are different entities, and we do not want to be kind of lumped into those diasporic policies in a wrong way. So there is definitely, I think, a difference in terms of a cultural and political orientation. And in terms of culture, of course, what I'm trying to do with the book and the chapter, I think, is to show you there are many different types. How Chineseness is imagined varies. So in terms of culture as well, there's not just one culture, right? It's fluid, and there are many versions of it. And then finally, I think is there one more question on how they respond to the stereotypes? Yes, so I talk a little bit about this in the book, especially in the chapter on Chinatown. I found it interesting that for the chapter on Chinatown, where I say Singaporean Chinese actually position Chinese migrants into the new Chinatown, which is Geylang, by saying that, oh, that's where they belong. They don't even belong to our Chinatown. It's not good enough for them. They belong in Geylang. That's what I argue in that chapter. New Chinese arrivals actually took that up and self-orientalized to say, oh, we are the kind of kinder flows of globalization than Singaporeans who are cold and more robotic. So that's the kind of responses that have occurred in some ways, if you read the book. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to put several questions together since we have a few minutes left. So one cluster of questions comes to, how much is this sense that of ethnic Chinese migrants from the PRC being seen as an embarrassment because they remind Singaporean ethnic Chinese of themselves and their past, one that they like to disassociate from, right? And so that also raises questions of, so how can ethnic Chinese, migrating from the PRC that integrate in Singapore society, or is this reproduction of difference going to be quite entrenched and difficult to overcome? And I think as a take on that, right, there's a further question. Well, are there ways that migrants from the PRC can find solidarity with other groups who are similarly discriminated against in Singapore? And I suppose this leads us to the question that Yo-Yen posed, which is, can you talk a little bit more about the class background of the individuals that that you spoke with your informants? Because there's a possibility that different people from Singapore, from different class backgrounds, might have different responses. Just similarly, the people from the PRC who migrated from the PRC with different class backgrounds might have different kinds of reception locally. I hope that got everything. Sorry if I mangled your questions. Right. Sylvia?
Hey, yes. This is a lot. Okay, let's see. Embarrassment. That's an interesting angle to look at. That they see Singaporeans see themselves as maybe the past. Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but that's an interesting angle. I don't feel like I'm authority to look at that because I haven't researched that. And then there's a reproduction of difference. Is it difficult to overcome? I think there needs to be more awareness. I think as far as I know, the people I've spoken to, I don't think Singaporeans and Singaporean-Chinese in general have frames of reference or will acknowledge that the kind of things they do with stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination is there. Because I think there is not enough frames of reference in thinking about inter-ethnic tensions. So I think we need to kind of make that known that discrimination is not only between people of color and white people, it's also can be inter-ethnic. And I think that will help in overcoming that. Migrants to find solidarity. I think, yes, certainly, if it would be great, ideally, in a utopia. But unfortunately, I think there are a lot of differences, whether constructed or real, in the migrant groups, especially, I think, of class. So, Elaine Ho and Lavanya Katirarivu has written about this, about how within the Indian diaspora there's class, castes, and also temporalities when they arrived that create this kind of differences that make them hard to kind of unite. And that is only in one diaspora. So imagine the many different groups of migrants that we have. And finally, I think with Yo-Yen's question about class, yes, I think certainly the backgrounds of my Singaporean Chinese respondents actually vary. So, for example, Jia Hua and Mary that we met, Jia Hua and Mary are of more working class background, but Janet and Benjamin are actually of middle class background. And I think it would be interesting to go further into it. Of course, if I wanted to, I think, investigate more, but I did feel like, from my general research experience, that their narratives didn't differ much in terms of how they demarcate the Chinese migrant. And it has a lot to do with class precarity as well. And I think, why it comes, I think the class precarity comes not only from the working class, but also from the middle class, because the middle class's definition is it being sandwiched, right? And I've actually talked about this as well, about how establishing one as a proper Chinese, the kind of respectable Chinese, actually establishes a middle class Chineseness that demarcates against Chinese migrants. Yes.
Okay, just going to take liberty because there's one question I missed, but I think it's important to get to. This is Kai-Sin Liang's about whether the situation in Singapore is similar to Hong Kong and how they react to mainland Chinese migrants. On the outset, this might seem like what we've talked about before, but what occurred to me is that in Singapore and also to some degree in Taiwan, and the comparison is, so the PRC, is trying to subsume Hong Kong into its rule. They're trying to have these claims over Taiwan. So there's a certain sense of precarity. Singapore doesn't have that problem, but Singapore has an acute sense of cultivated vulnerability and precarity. We're told how vulnerable we are, how small we are. We're always going to be eaten out. So that creates a sense of real anxiety towards things that are foreign and different. So I'm wondering whether you think that comparisons to be made, or is the characterization that I just given you just completely out of whack?
I think that comparison that Ian just said is spot on. I think it's really at the heart of Singapore's, this tensions is really cultivated precarity and vulnerability. Whereas I think politically, right? I mean, what's happening in Taiwan and Hong Kong, they actually have this relationship with China that it's not replicated, it's not the same as what we have in Singapore. So a lot of it is cultivated, a lot of it is constructed. Yes.
All right. Well, I think we managed to race through all the questions. So thank you so much for indulging us and giving us this real treat. And thank you so much, Ian Wen, for your comments. Now, those of you online who wish to get in touch with Sylvia about her research, in the chat, her contact is there. And this talk will be it's live streamed now, but we will also put it online on the Academia SG Facebook. So thank you all for spending your Friday afternoon with us. It's been a real treat to have Sylvia. If we could all thank her, and thank all of you for joining us. Have a good afternoon and have a great weekend. Thanks.